Global economic distress, fueled by the pandemic and deepened by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, made several vulnerable countries into economic free fall. Sri Lanka is the most visible Asian country that suffers from an economic meltdown and political downfall that was fueled by economic distress. While Pakistan is another South Asian country, currently drowning in a growing debt crisis, dwindling forex reserves, soaring inflation, and increasing political instability, have pushed the nation to the brink of an economic disaster. Do these economic disasters in South Asia could also possibly happen in countries in Southeast Asia? Let's take a quick overview of the reasons why Sri Lanka's economy and the political system completely collapsed. Sri Lanka is an island state in the Indian Ocean, located at the southern tip of the Indian continent. It has a population of over 22 million with a gross domestic product of $84.5 billion as of 2021. Sri Lanka is a net importer country, meaning the country imports more than what they export. Though generally, it is not an issue, as most countries are also in the same scenario. But in the case of Sri Lanka, its foreign currency reserve is now almost empty, from $7.6 billion in 2019, to a record low of $50 million early this year. This is also exacerbated by its growing foreign debts costing $51 billion. Recently, they defaulted on a $78 million loan from international creditors, further impeding its ability to boost its reserves. Without foreign currency reserves, it hinders the state to purchase basic commodities from the international market. Current supplies will not able to meet its domestic demand, resulting in a spike in price. In addition, Sri Lankans are queuing for entire days to get fuel and food, adding to an increasingly drastic situation even harder. The country's inflation rate reached a record high of 54.6% in June this year. Tourism and overseas remittance are the main sources of the country's foreign reserves. While Sri Lanka, once a vibrant tourism industry, labeled as the growth engine of the country, with millions of tourists visiting each year, was devastated just overnight. The country faced a horrific terrorist incident in April 2019, which resulted in the deaths of 250 people, of which 42 were foreign nationals traveling to Sri Lanka. Tourist arrival fell down in the following months. Adding to the woes, when the pandemic struck, Sri Lanka's already distressed tourism sector came into a major blow, and its remittance from abroad turned out to be no exception that worsened the situation. While its government policy tries to provide solutions, it adds fuels to the igniting economic disaster. When Sri Lanka's foreign currency shortages became a serious problem in early 2021, the government tried to limit them by banning imports of chemical fertilizer. This is the first country in the world to practice 100% organic farming. Its agricultural production was cut in half, adding to the country's food crisis. The country's taxation reform in 2019 dwindles the country's revenue by about 800 billion rupees, increasing the fiscal monetary pressures on the country's limited national budget. The roots of the crisis lie in tax cuts enacted by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa in late 2019, which came months before the COVID-19 pandemic that battered the country's lucrative tourism industry, and led to a drop in foreign workers' remittances. Worsening the situation is the food crisis resulting from the government policy of 100% organic farming, and the disruption of the global commodity and food supply chain, brought about by the Russia and Ukraine war. In addition to its accumulative government foreign debts, from its multi-billion infrastructure projects which no visible return to the country. The economic downturn of Sri Lanka exacerbates the country's political instability. From the president's poor governance to economic mismanagement and widespread corruption leads the country into complete economic collapse and political and social unrest. Growing external debt, dwindling forex reserves, soaring inflation, and increasing political instability are the main drivers of Sri Lankan downfall. Are these conditions present in any of the countries here in Southeast Asia? Let's take a look. Sri Lanka's external debt to GDP is around 65%. In Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia, and Malaysia are amongst, with highest external debt percentages in comparison to their GDP with 76%, 75.1%, and 69.6% respectively. However, in comparison with its foreign currency reserves, these Southeast Asian countries have adequate reserves as compared to Sri Lanka to finance its import, except for Laos for having the least reserve of $1.5 billion, which could only cover up to 2.4 months of its imports. Cambodia's external debt reaching $20.3 billion, which is 75.1% of its GDP, is one of the highest in the region. But it is supported by $20.3 billion in reserves, which can cover 7 months of its imports. Cambodia has the lowest risk of distress among the smaller states in the region. Other major ASEAN economies' external debts are below the threshold, with the Philippines being the lowest in the region with 27.5% of GDP. The Philippines' reserves is also the most stable in the region, which covers for 9.6 months of the country's import. Followed by Indonesia with 32.3%, with reserves covers up to 6.7 months of imports, Thailand with 38.6%, whose reserves covers 9 months of its import, and Vietnam's external debts reach 41% of its GDP, with reserves of $109.4 billion adequate to cover for 3.7 months of the country's imports. Singapore's external debt reached $1.8 trillion, which is 448% of its GDP, but Singapore is a net creditor country. It simply means, its external assets are more than sufficient to cover its external debts. Once offsetted, Singapore actually has zero debts. Is Malaysia could be the next Sri Lanka? As Malaysia's external debts are rising, concern for bankruptcy was upheld. But citing the current prevailing economic indicators, the chances of Malaysia going bankrupt are very slim. Malaysia is the only major economy in the region with the highest external debt, which reached up to 69.6% of its GDP, which is higher than Sri Lanka. But the difference is that Malaysia's reserves of $107 billion could cover its import for 5.7 months. In addition, International Monetary Fund never raised bankruptcy issues for Malaysia, and its economy is also expected to grow by 5.7% in 2022. That is above the IMF's 3.6% forecast for the global economy, and 5.4% for emerging and developing Asia in April. But Malaysia's additional external debts might be risky, as its tax revenue of 11% of its GDP is low relative to the Philippines' 18%, Thailand's 17.2%, and Singapore's 13.3%, while its percentage of revenue going to servicing interest payments is relatively high of 15.3% in 2020 to 18% of current projection as compared to Philippines' 13.3%, Thailand 5%, and Singapore 2%. While Malaysia is not in danger of defaulting on its loans like Sri Lanka, there is a clear need to improve its debt affordability and reduce the proportion of revenue spent on debt servicing. The Philippines' debt outlook is one of the most stable in the region. However, the country's bottleneck is the balance of payment. The dollar inflow of the country is not enough to cover its dollar outflow. The dollar deficit in June amounted to $1.5 billion, wider compared with the $312 million deficit in June last year, but slightly smaller compared to May when the shortfall stood at $1.6 billion. In the first 6 months of the year, the balance of payment deficit amounted to $3.1 billion, bigger than the $1.9 billion deficit recorded in the same period last year. The central bank attributed the bigger gap to a yawning trade deficit, as rallying world oil prices and improving domestic demand from Filipinos emerging from lockdowns bloat the country's import bill. Though it has no effect on the country's capacity to pay, but it will add to the country's trade deficits, which affect its gross domestic product overall balance. The likelihood of sovereign defaults is growing with frontier nations including Laos and Myanmar, after Sri Lanka failed to pay its foreign debt. Laos economy is more vulnerable to economic downfall. A decade of colossal debt accrual and economic mismanagement by communist authorities in Laos has finally tipped the country towards bankruptcy. with its foreign reserves, incapable of meeting its loan obligations without outside help. Currently, annual foreign debt servicing has grown to $1.4 billion from $1.2 billion in 2018 and just $160 million in 2010, when external debt servicing could be met with domestic income. By the end of last year, according to World Bank figures, Laos public debt stood at 88% of gross domestic product, and foreign debt at $14.5 billion. Vientiane needs $1.3 billion a year to meet its obligations until 2025, but only holds about $1.2 billion in foreign reserves. For many, it would be too easy to blame China, which accounts for about 47% of Laos debt. Accumulated on the back of major infrastructure projects and their debt traps, which have left their mark on countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Fiji. Neither the war in Ukraine, nor the crushing impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is an excuse. The main reason behind Laos' economic collapse is the perennial thorn of corruption and poor economic management. The country is also in combat of the staggering effect of inflation, which reaches 12.8%. Laos is most exposed to default due to high external borrowing, a surging import bill, and scarce foreign reserves. While Myanmar's ban on payments of private external debt, the Central Bank of Myanmar ordered companies and individual borrowers to suspend the payment of foreign loans last week, the latest move to defend the nation's dwindling foreign exchange reserves. Myanmar has sufficient foreign reserves to avoid an economic crisis similar to Sri Lanka, according to the military government, pushing back on suggestions by some analysts that the country faces a growing possibility of default. Myanmar is among the frontier market economies where the likelihood of sovereign defaults, where the economy remains fragile, as dollar shortages limit the availability of key imported products, resulting in price inflation, particularly among commodities.